Exposure value is one way to adjust the brightness of your rendering by just simply plugging in a single number here. But we can also use real-world metrics to do the same thing. So if you are a photographer and if you've spent your whole life working with f-stops and film speeds and so on, then you can also use this method. We can choose photographic exposure and set values here. So for example, I could say I want my shutter to be open for a 30th of a second. And I want to shoot at f2. And this is physically accurate. This is basically the same result that you would get on a set or a location if you set your camera to these values and had a 100-watt bulb. So let's do a render of that. Now you can see it's quite dim. So you can expect that we would have to have faster film. We would have to have a higher film speed. Again, this is purely optional. You don't have to use this, but I like to use it because it's, I get to repurpose my knowledge of how cameras work. So what I recommend that you do in a case like this is just simply increase the film speed. And there's no limits on these. We could do whatever we want, unlike a real camera. Our film speed could be infinite. So let's try ISO 600. Okay, that's still too dim. Well, we could take this up to ISO 1200 or however high we want to take it. Now, the thing that I want you to know about this is that unlike a real camera, the shutter speed and f-stop do not affect the quality of the rendering. In other words, shutter speed on a real camera controls how much motion blur you get. If the shutter is open for a long period of time, moving objects will be really blurred. If the shutter is open for a short period of time, then objects will have less blur on them. That doesn't work through here. Changing the shutter speed does not affect your motion blur at all. That's controlled through the camera settings in the render setup. So I'm just going to show it to you here. We're not actually going to be doing any animation in this course, but just want to illustrate this to you so you would see it. If we go to the renderer tab, I've got to scroll down. I'm looking for the camera settings. Here we go. So it's in the camera effects. We can turn on motion blur, and we have to set our shutter speed and so on in here instead of in the exposure control. So don't let that confuse you. This is where we control motion blur. Likewise, if you want depth of field effects, if you want focusing effects where certain objects are in focus at a certain distance, objects at another distance might be out of focus, that would be dealt with once again not through the exposure control, but through the camera effects rollout within the render setup dialog. Because these depth of field and motion blur effects are essentially post effects, they're essentially cheats that are applied after the main scene is rendered. Okay, so all that has to be dealt with through here. So that's how you would use the photographic exposure controls to emulate a real camera.